I always want to stress, um, the basic Lakota Star Knowledge concept, and that reality begins within. And so it doesn't matter who you are or what you are, or what race you are. That's irrelevant. It's beautiful, but it's not the deciding factor in your life. That the deciding factor is inside of you. Yeah, this is where reality begins. So, and it's so evident. Like when you see a family where somebody from a different culture comes into that family as a baby, and then when this child grows up, it only knows the world that it's been raised inside, and it identifies itself as a member of that family, a member of that social group, um, a member of that society, because that is all it knows. And it knows that perspective. It's all it's ever come into communication with. And so it knows the perspective of that culture. It has the same thought process as those who come from that culture because that's all it knows. It was raised in that culture. Yeah. So that's important to remember. That reality begins within. When you're talking about this topic, reality begins within. I want to talk about adoption. Um, I'll give a little history. When we're talking about the history of the reservation. A lot of times, alcohol was a big factor. Alcohol abuse. Um, we're talking early 1900s here. A lot of times, children were um, sent to boarding schools, and then later these same children, these boarding schools were hundreds of miles away from their homeland, and so a lot of times these are church schools, and the priests would tell these children that their parents died, that everybody died. They did this to keep them from returning to the reservation and hopefully to adopt them out to white families. And it was really a bad time, yeah? Actually, more of a sad time. So, like, I'll give you an extreme example. Back in those days, we're talking, like I said, um, you know, mid 1900s, maybe, shortly before World War II, shortly after World War II, that time period. And a lot of times, Indian children, like I said, they were told that their family members were dead, and so they had nowhere to go. And there were these rich white people that they had this. It was like a fad, yeah. Um, in that it was like, hey, let's adopt Indians and let's see what they can do. And they would have contests, and like people would say, okay, look at my Indian. My Indian's reciting poetry, and so that Indian kid would be standing there, reciting poetry, and another family would say, oh, look at my Indian. My Indian plays piano, yeah, or look at my Indian. My Indian plays the violin, and so they would adopt these Indian kids and really give them good training and the arts, things like that. And but it was not to help the Indian kid. It was to make themselves look better. Yeah, the Indian kid was just a pawn to make the rich white family look good. So a lot of rich white families did this in America. And as soon as the child started to enter puberty, then they would focus on adopting another one. But they would still keep this one until it was 18 because it's a law. Yeah. So as soon as the Indian kid turned 18 years old, these rich white families would then just push these kids out onto the street. Basically, they had to survive on their own. They had to fend for themselves. And maybe when just think about that. You had a little Indian kid that's stolen from the reservation, adopted to a rich white family, and during that time, it's probably had dinner with the President of the United States. Yeah, it's probably traveled to Europe. But as soon as they come back, I mean, as soon as the child turns 18 years old, it's not cute anymore. So it's not a kid anymore. So they basically just say, okay, there's the door. Yeah, have a good life. And they weren't kept in wills. They were a lot of these children. They died in the streets. Just think about that. Their whole lives were nothing but a game for white people, rich white people. Yeah, that they were just used, for superficial reasons. And a lot of them ended up on the streets. They ended up dead. They ended up becoming prostitutes to try to survive. They became drug addicts. They really lived horrible lives. And when I was working at the library at Cheyenne River Community College many years ago, I found a book written by a woman who this happened to her. She was from a small tribe in California, and she said basically, her tribe was not a treaty tribe, and so they had to beg, for money. Tourists would come on their reservation. They would sell, whatever. And I hear she said in her case, a family from New York City came in and they wanted to buy an Indian kid. And they were super rich, and they gave this family a few $100s, which is ridiculous, even back then. And they, no, I take that back. Now I remember, she was bought for $35. Now I remember that, yeah. And the family was so poor that there are several children, and most likely they were going to starve to death. So they saw no way out. And when this rich white family offered to buy one of their kids for $35, they took it. It shows you how it affected their thinking. Yeah. So this child was raised in a rich white family, and she said this is what happened to her. And but in her case, when the family traveled to Europe, she stayed home. Yeah, she would talk about how they traveled to London and to Paris, but when she had to stay home, she couldn't go, and she wasn't even allowed to leave their mansion. Now they had a penthouse mansion, and she wasn't allowed to even go outside. She was basically a prisoner, but she was living in comfort. Yeah, so she learned how to read, she learned how to write, she was a classical pianist. But as soon as she became, I think in her situation, as soon as she reached 16 years old, they basically threw her, they took her outside. They didn't say where she was going, they just said, you're going to be traveling, they said. So she was excited. So she had her bag, and they took her to somewhere near Times Square. The limousine chauffeur opened the door, and he said goodbye, closed the door, and he drove off. And she didn't know what to do. So, she had to start, looking for, help. And thank goodness she could speak English. So she, was able to, try survive as best as she could. And you have to remember the sentiment was very bad towards Indian people. So she had to identify herself as another culture to get room to stay. Things. She didn't even have any money. She had to find a job to Basically, she was sleeping in the park, basically, in the beginning, and was able to somehow find a job and find a place to live. And this book, when it was written, she was in her 60s. It talks about her life. And I can't remember the title of the book. I remember everything else, and I had the book, and I loaned it to a friend, and that friend never gave it back, and I ended up moving to Germany. So lost track of that book, but it's a true story, yeah. And this shows you the kind of things that happened back in those days, yeah. In other instances, social services goes onto the reservation because they get a request from a white family to adopt an Indian kid. So they go on to the, let's say it's an American family, so they go to Canada. Yeah, they go to Canada, and they tell social services up there they want to adopt a Indian kid. So social services goes up to the reserve. They call it reserve in Canada, and looks for a family that's known to have alcohol problems. And even if the family's not drunk, the social service goes in there and says, okay, we're finding this home unfit to raise children, so we're taking these children from you. They would just outright steal these children from the Indian families, and the tribal leaders didn't do anything about it. And so these children ended up becoming adopted to some white family in America. It was always white families. And so they call them what do they call them? The lost generation, I think they call them. And so they grew up. A lot of times they weren't even told they were Indian. Yeah, they wondered, and eventually the parents would say, "Oh yeah, you're part Latin or something like that, from Latin America," but they wouldn't tell them they were Indians. So they grew up like that. Yeah, and sometimes it was good, sometimes it was bad. And a lot of times when they found out they were Indian, they would go back to Canada when they're adults and look for their family and try to find them again. Yeah, and try to reunite with their biological family. Most of the time it didn't work. America, same thing happened. Indian kids were taken from families where there was alcohol, and they were by court order they were adopted out to white people. This happened to three of my cousins, all from one family. And it was by pure accident that my mother found one of them. The oldest one was a girl, and it just turned out that she was on the Rosebud Reservation and living with a kind of well-to-do farmer family. And that lady was really nice. I remember we were at that powwow, and my mom bumped into a woman, and she said, yeah, this farmer family has two Indian girls. Maybe one of them is, she said, one of them I know, and I think the other one's name is Rosetta. So, and that was my cousin that was adopted. So my mom kept asking questions, and then she called this farmer lady, and if she could meet this girl, and the lady said, yeah, it's no problem. So they had a meeting, because we drove out to this farm and went into that house, and it was really a nice house. There's two Indian girls there, and here my mom recognized her, and it was kind of a tearful reunion, because Rose didn't know. She was taken when she was a little girl, and she didn't know what happened after that. And here now she's almost 18 years old. So she grew up among white people. And then her brothers, my mom didn't find them until 1978. And because in 1978 there was a law called American Indian Child Welfare Act, something like that. And this basically said that all adoption records have to be opened from concerning Indian children who were adopted out, and the records are supposed to be made public to the families so they can find these children. And so through that act, my mom located my two cousins, this Rosetta's brothers. They were adopted by kind of a well-to-do farmer family in Minnesota, or close to Minnesota, anyway. And when I was like about 18 years old when I met these two. And if you close your eyes and you listen to these two boys talk, they sounded like white guys. They did not sound like Indians whatsoever. When they were adopted, the older brother, he was about 3 years old, and the younger one was a baby. No, the older brother was 2 years old, and the younger one was just a newborn, just a couple of months old. So they never learned anything about being Indian. The only world they knew was this white farmer world. So they sounded like white guys. That was so freaky. You had to hear them talk, and it was a culture shock for them. But it was kind of weird though, because these three kids, when they realized their family was still alive, because all three of them were told by social services that their family was dead. Now this is 1960s here. Yeah? And even up until then, the Indian kids that are adopted out, they were told by social services that their families died, that there's no one left. So when they're reunited with family, it's mixed feelings for them. In one sense, they're happy because they realize they have an Indian family. In the other sense, they're pissed because they were lied to. That they were, that this was, that they were tricked. And it messed them up when this happened. When they realized that one of them really developed the problem, and the other one of them became alcoholic, and the other one, I don't know, there's something wrong. But I don't know. Maybe they were already that way. I don't know. But all I know is that there's something not right. And I used to think maybe it's because they're missing their cultural identity. Then I'm rethinking that. Well, actually, I already rethought it. Yeah, in that they do have a culture. Their culture is where they grew up. I think of it like this: in the early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s, throughout America, a lot of times, maybe for example, a group of Indians might come upon a community of white people and totally exterminate them from that group. Yeah, just totally annihilate that group and kill everybody, even children, to send a message to the white world: don't come here. Yeah? Then they leave, thinking everybody's dead. A little while later, a different tribe comes through to see what happened, and then maybe they find a baby among this group. Everybody is dead except for this baby. So a family takes the baby. This is a baby maybe just a couple months old. Maybe it's a 1-year-old. So they take this baby, this child, and they raise it as one of them. So this child grows up learning that tribal perspective, that tribal language. It becomes a member of one of its warrior societies or women's societies, depending on the gender of the child. It even takes an Indian partner for husband or wife. And the child is considered one of them, because that's all it knows. It never got a chance to grow up in the world that it came from. Instead, it grew up in the Indian world. And the family that took it in treats it as one of them. It's a member of their clan, their extended family, whatever family system they have. It's considered a member, and relatives consider it a relative. Yeah? The Indians considered this white kid one of them because that's all this kid knew. It didn't know one word of English. All it spoke was this Indian language. It took an Indian wife or husband, had children. This guy or girl was accepted into the community as one of them. So they said, "You're Indian. That's all you know." Yeah? Then maybe it grows up to an adult and it realizes, yeah, it can go among the white people in white people clothes and learn things. Then usually when situations like this happen, they didn't like it because that's not their world. They didn't, even though they're white, they didn't grow up in that world. So they run back to the Indian world because that's all they know. That's their culture. But you see, they grew up like that. Because that's all they knew. You see what I mean? The argument goes, it's also true for Indians who are adopted by white people. That as babies, yeah, as little babies when they're adopted by white people and they're away from the reservation, that's all they know. Is how to be from that culture. Should we Indians look down upon them just because they don't know what it is to be Indian? Should we look down on them and say that they're less than? Should we say, you need to come back to us. You're Indian. You have to be raised by us because you're an Indian. I think that has racist overtones, if you ask me. And this same act that I spoke about earlier, this American Indian Child and Welfare Act, this was also a law that stated that Indian children cannot be adopted by white people. Indian children can only be adopted by white people as a last resort. The law says that if the child is in need of a home, that the first preference is supposed to be given to relatives of the parents. Second preference is supposed to be to any member of that tribe the child comes from. Third preference is to any American Indian family in the United States. And the last resort is anybody not Indian. But when social services they break the law anyway. Even to this day, they still break the law. And then they take the child and give it to a white family. And allegedly there is what do you call it? Some kind of law that says that when children are adopted out, the state earns a certain amount of money from the federal government when the Indian child is adopted out. That the state gets a certain sum of money. So the more Indian children that are put into white families, the more money the state earns from Washington, D.C. Something like that. I don't know how true that is. I have yet to see that documentation. There's a lawyer that says that, the native lawyer that's kind of American Indian movement thinking, but I don't like that guy anyway. I kind of don't believe a lot of what he says. He's using his law degree as an appeal to authority fallacy, which is a dualistic way of communicating to exert power over others. Yeah. So I really don't agree with. I don't believe what he's saying. I need to check that out myself. But see, here's the situation: is that families, even though this law exists, it's still being broken by social services. There were several court cases. I remember one was in the 1980s. It happened to a white family in Idaho. They adopted this Indian child whose father was from the Pine Ridge Reservation. And this guy from Pine Ridge was a Mormon, and he was, I think he was going to Rick's University in Idaho. This is what do you call it, like a preparatory college before you, or Rick's College, yeah, it's a preparatory college. If you can't get into Brigham Young University, they're both Mormon schools. And I think that's how come he was over there. So he had he was a Mormon, and he had a girlfriend who was also Mormon, but she was white. And they were kind of from the wild crowd, yeah. They were partiers, and he got this white girl pregnant, and then they were together for a while. Then he came back to the res. He didn't give a shit, yeah, because he's a drunk, yeah. He's kind of a loser guy. He didn't care, yeah. He knocked the girl up, and he didn't want to be around, so he went back to the res. This is a true story. And you know why I know it's true? Because I know his ex-girlfriend. Yeah, it's not the same woman, but she's also from, his ex-girlfriend is from Pine Ridge, and I know this lady, and she's truthful, and she's true blue. So she told me the inside information, yeah, and she said, yeah, he didn't really care for this. He doesn't want to hang around, yeah, after he gets girls pregnant. A lot of Indian guys are like that. They're really unhealthy. And see, this is another evidence. Just because you're Indian doesn't mean you're good. Yeah? So that's for all you Indian racists out there. Anyway, this white, so this girl, the mother, is a white woman, as I said, yeah? And she was in no position to raise a family. So she decided to put the child up for adoption as soon as it was born. So she made arrangements with social services. They found a family, a loving family, that adopted this. They were ready. So after the baby was born, the baby was given to this family because they couldn't conceive, they couldn't have children, and so they raised this child. It came into a home of love, and where it was wanted, yeah, and the mother, even though it hurt, she in the end she knew her child was going to be well taken care of, that it was going to have a home, would be surrounded by people who love her. I think it was a girl, and that made her feel good. It should make anybody feel good that hears that the child is going into a home that's filled with love. And this couple cannot have children, so this is their dream come true. Well, the mother of the boy, the Pine Ridge guy, and she heard about that, and she was like, "Hey, wait a minute! This is violating that American Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978." That state social services in Idaho broke the law, which is true. They did break the law. But I'm starting to question that law myself, because Lakota Star Knowledge teaches that it doesn't matter what race you are. What matters is your inside world, your sacred center. That has no culture. That has no language. That's where the emphasis is supposed to be, and not the skin color. So, this family from Pine Ridge, they sued the state of Idaho and they wanted that child. And they were saying, this child belongs with its own people. This child belongs with its culture. And you're robbing the culture from this child. That's going to result in a, conflict in the future. And I don't think that's always true. I think that depends on the child's personality. It depends on the parenting. It depends on its experiences, that it has, and the child, grew attached to this family in Idaho, and there looked like there was a chance that this Pine Ridge family was going to win the court case. At that time this was happening, I was on the side of Pine Ridge because I agreed with that. I agreed with that family saying this kid needs to be raised with Indian family. It needs to know its tribal identity, because without it, it's going to be missing something, and something will be wrong. As I got deeper into Lakota Star knowledge, I realized that that's not really too important. That what's more important and what has to be there, even if you want to express your cultural identity, you cannot do it from there. You have to do it from within you. And within you there is no culture. There is no language. Within you is where reality begins, in your sacred center, where your body, your mind, your soul, and your emotions connect to each other. That's the most important thing. The child could still learn about its culture, but it doesn't have to be among those people, because it's in a home where people really love it. They want it. And that's all that child knows. What's wrong with that? As long as this child is going to be accepted as a member of their family, and that race makes no difference whatsoever, then I don't think there's a problem. Yeah? I think it's totally okay. Because the chances, I hate to say this, but the chance is really high that if that Pine Ridge family had won that court case, that this child might grow up to be a suicide victim. Because Indian children from good homes, where there's no alcohol abuse, no drug abuse, children from homes like that are committing suicide because there's something wrong on the reservation. That has to be addressed. Yeah? So I think that child, now I disagree with what I was thinking earlier. I think it was, what was more important was that this child had a steady home. Because on the reservation, it's really hard to find a home that's steady. And I talk about my own reservation, Cheyenne River, and the community that I come from in Dupree. There were only 2 families I can think of that had a steady foundation, where there was no alcohol in the home, there was no drug abuse, and the parents loved their children, and they told the children this, and they showed it to them, and they helped their children. There were only 2 families that were like that, with no alcohol around, no drugs around. All the other homes, there was alcohol abuse. There's drug abuse. And whether the children from those families realize it or not, that's going to affect their foundation, and it's going to be weak. You see what I mean? So that that is my thought on that. Now I'm still going to continue. I know several really good stories that I'm going to talk about next. Okay, where this worked out really good, of Indian children being adopted by non-Indian families. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. Okay, because it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot of good stories that helped. And I think the focus needs to be on the inner identity, the sacred center. That's where that focus has to be. And as long as you have that there, you know, you can be raised anywhere, because you're going to be raised in a healthy way. Talking about identity and the importance of cultural identity, but at the same time, you know, Lakota Star Knowledge is teaching that the most important identity is what's inside of you. And this has nothing to do with your skin color. And skin color, you know, we were not created as skin colors. You know, as human, Lakota Star Knowledge says in the beginning there was one continent, and humans appeared in 5 areas, and eventually they interacted. And as they settled in their areas, you know, there's several stories that talk about the separation of the continents, and I'm not going to go into that because I don't have enough time. But it's because of humans becoming dualistic and starting to oppress one another, and that results in a catastrophe worldwide, in which the continents separate. And this doesn't happen overnight. It's a really, really slow process, but it did happen. And when you take all that into consideration, and where people settled for millions of years, this is you know, this allows for time for human bodies to adapt to the environments that they're living in, and that's where skin color comes in. That's part of the adaptation to the ecosystem in which a society lives in. And hair texture, eye color, you know, all that. That's how that comes into play. That's what Lakota Star Knowledge says. It's in the beginning it says we're all Ikjeoyate, meaning human beings. It doesn't even mention the word Lakota at all in these stories. These are ancient stories that are talking about a time, you know, millions of years before the white buffalo calf pipe, before the sun dance. You know, these are really, really old stories, and this focuses on your inside identity. And this is because reality begins within. This is the way the universe was created, as well as all other universes that were created before and will be created afterwards. It's a never-ending cycle. And so to focus on skin color is to move away from your sacred center. And this is how duality is created, because people are focusing on the surface of our identities, and then coming to the point where, you know, hey, you know, we are better, we're smarter, we're stronger, we know what's right, and you know, things like that. So I got a message from one of my students who kind of interrupted me here. Sorry about that. I'll get back to that later. So the individual identity, what's inside of you, where your physical body, your mind, your emotions, and your spirit connect. That's what's important, and it's that has no culture, that has no nationality, no language. And cultures have been evolving over millions of years. Millions of years, yeah. And so this is you know, when you're talking about things like Sundance and the pipe, and that stuff is not even 2,000 years old. Even the white buffalo calf pipe, that's not even 600 years old. And what I'm talking about is really ancient. And see that a lot of these ceremonies, they're focusing on the skin, yeah, the cultural identity. The pipe is the same thing. What I'm talking about is more important than that, because what I'm talking about is where reality begins. Now, when you take that information, that you really have to, when you're looking at it from the star knowledge perspective, you really have to keep that in mind. Yeah, that what's inside of you is the most important thing, and living a healthy life. Yeah, and you don't have to be a certain culture to do that. It all depends on how you are inside of yourself. Do you have peace inside of yourself and things like that? That's more important than these other things. So take that into consideration, and sometimes, like I said, we're talking about adoption. I know many stories of and there are a lot of similarities. And the way I know this is because people write to me and they tell me these things. And one of the most beautiful stories I heard was just recently. And there's a young lady who was adopted when she was a baby. And she was raised by a white family. And they did live for a time in South Dakota, but they traveled the world, basically. The father had an important job with like at U.S. embassies around the world. So she grew up in different parts of the world and really experienced a lot of different cultures. And at the same time, her family, that most people would probably say her foster family, but this is her family. This is all she knows. Yeah, and so they encourage her to learn about her, where she comes from, her culture. Yeah, that's totally fine. They have no fears because they know deep down inside that she's their daughter. Yeah, that's all she knows. That's all. Yeah, that's all she knows. And so they want her, to explore this other part of herself, that, to learn about it and to appreciate it. Yeah, and because we do that, they do that because, they live in different parts of the world. They're always, moving in South America and in the Arab Emirates and all over the world, and so they've grown to appreciate other cultures and things like this. So if they that when you do this, I know this for a fact. When you do this, you learn to appreciate your own culture, and you don't take things for granted. Yeah, and you see the beauty in everything. And so this is in that spirit. They're encouraging her to learn her language and to learn her cultural traditions, and because it's just an extension of what's inside of her, and that's intact. Yeah, she knows, she knows she was adopted, and she has a last name. Where her mother came from, and it was so funny because I know that last name. In fact, I even know a young lady with that last name. It's not her mother, but most likely it's a relative. Yeah, so I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah, and this lady she's living in another part of the world. Yeah, she's not in America right now. She's in another part of the world. And so it's nice. Yes, she's traveling. She sees the world. She learns other cultures, and she wants to know her own. But deep down inside, she knows what's important. Yeah, that what's important is her sacred center. And so I hear lots of stories like that. Yeah, that some really nice stories where, yes, they were adopted out of the tribe, but where they went into was a house of love, a home of love. And most of these families, they did not want to deny that the child was Indian. They wanted the child to grow up to learn about its culture, to appreciate it, and not keep it away. Yeah, but see, these kind of children, are they really lost when they're in those kind of homes? When they grow up in the home where their mom and dads really love them and they don't deny them their cultural heritage, and they take whenever there's events going on in their community involving anything Native American, they take their children there to watch the dancing, listen to the singing, and listen to the languages spoken, and just enjoy it. Just like any other culture, there's so much beauty in languages and cultures. But as long as you remember that deep down inside, there is a connection to all. And that connection has no culture. Yeah, that's your sacred center. So I don't think it's all bad. I don't think it's. I think when it messes up, I think there's lots of factors at work here, where, like, say for example, that the time period when social services was telling the adopted the foster parents that the step parents, I guess you could say, where they were telling the step parents that or foster parents that all the relatives of this child are dead. So they even lied to the foster parents. So they had no clue. Yeah, and a lot of these situations, they even though they didn't know the family that this child came from, they still took them to events that were Native American because they wanted them to appreciate their own culture, the child's culture, and also, to learn to appreciate other cultures too. So when a child grows up, this is a fact, when a child grows up in a multicultural family, the child is more open to things in life, is more, dare I say, enlightened, because they see things from different perspectives. And they don't say this was the right one, this is the wrong one. They don't say that. They just say, oh, that's interesting how they see it, and it's interesting how we see it, and yet we're looking at the same thing. When you can see other cultural perspectives like that, you see more dimension in reality, and a person just ends up appreciating life even more. Well, that's with healthy parenting, yeah. Because when sometimes children are sent into homes where it's not healthy, and next thing you know, they're going from home to home, back to maybe a children's home, and then in and out, and in those situations, these kind of foster parents, they're only doing this because there's money in it. They're not really raising the children. They just see these foster children as a paycheck. And there's a lot of that going around. That you don't even have to be Indian for that one. That happens to all kids from different cultures, that end up in situations like that, and then you end up with a troubled young adult. And so there's always different factors at play. There's always different variables. So it's going to be a different situation for different people. Yeah, and like I said, a lot of it depends on the foster parents because they're the primary caregivers So a lot of it depends on how they are. Now with this Lakota lady that I was telling you about, I don't know her foster parents if they could have children or not, but they love this girl like their own. Yeah, and she calls them mom and dad. It's the only mom and dad she knows. And you see them, you see pictures of them, and she's just Indian as heck, and the mom and dad are just whiter than hell, and but this is mom and dad, yeah, and she doesn't see them as skin color. See, that's I think one of the what do you call it, privileges when you are raised in a healthy home, and then you realize, the different skin colors are actually, you don't see it as one being better than the other. Yeah. So you can't say. I really believe that you cannot have a law that applies to all of Indian children, because in this lady's situation that I'm telling you about, this Lakota lady, if she were sent back to the reservation, the chance is incredibly high she would not have developed the way she did. She's not a racist. She is appreciative of people of different cultures. I'm pretty sure she speaks several languages now. And now she wants to know about her culture, her own culture. She is going through experiences that are bringing her to her culture. Now, that doesn't mean she's getting better. It just means that she's learning. Yeah, and she's not missing anything really. She's just learning about her cultural identity. She's not missing anything because reality begins within. Yeah, that's where home is. Home is within. So when you live in this way, this healthy way that I described at the beginning of the show, you can be home anywhere because your home is inside. You've found it, you've built it, you've developed it, and you can live anywhere in this world, and that's what this Lakota lady is starting to understand. She's lived all over the world, yeah, and so she's learning that her sacred center is intact. She's just not realizing it. So she's having a desire to learn her language, her culture, and she found the right person, yeah? Because I know the dualistic tendencies that happen on the reservation. So I'm trying to help her as much as I can. And so this is my message, yeah? That we should be focusing more on what's inside of us and not the skin color. And that law may not be a good law in all situations, because every situation is different. In some it might work, and some it might not. So I think that should be rewritten myself. Thank you for taking time to tune into the show. I'll see you tomorrow. Until next time, Doksha Ake.